Okay, so hi everyone and welcome to this webinar in the SSH Network webinar series. So that's the Social Sciences and Humanities Network related to IPES. My name is Håkon Stokland and I organize the SSH Network with Maria Stenseke and Marla Emery. And today we have a presentation that we've been looking very much forward to by Dr. Rolf Lidskog and Dr. James White, both from Örebro University. And it's titled Plurality, Paralysis, Practice, Making Environmental Knowledge Usable Under Conditions of Knowledge and Value Pluralism. I have to say, I really think this is a very important topic for IPES, so I'm really happy to have this presentation as part of the webinar series. And so I will just give a little introduction to the speaker before handing over the word. So as I mentioned, Rolf Lidskog and James White are both affiliated with the Örebro University, more specifically at the Environmental Sociology section. Rolf Lidskog has a PhD in sociology and also a PhD in ethics, both from Uppsala University. He's professor of sociology at Örebro University. His research interests include environmental policy and politics at the international and national levels, especially the role of expertise in environmental governance. A central issue in his research is how actors perceive, evaluate, and manage risks, where there are conflicting views on what is the most suitable way to manage them. And to answer this question, he has studied a variety of environmental areas: climate change, air pollution policy, nuclear waste management, hazardous waste management, and also biodiversity. James White is a researcher on the making knowledge usable and also advancing behavioral change through an inclusive Green Deal project. His PhD from Maynooth University, Ireland, examined the development and implementation of international standards for smart and sustainable cities. He's interested in transdisciplinary environmental expertise and the documents, measures, and standardized technologies that put them into practice. And with that, Rolf and Jim, I give you the floor.
First of all, I would like to thank for inviting us to this seminar and to have the opportunity to present some findings and thoughts about this topic. And Jim and I will share this presentation, and before starting, I'll give just some basic information about the research context. Environmental sociology is about 10 years old, and we consist of 15 researchers in environmental sociology. And there are 3 projects that are in particular relevant for this presentation. And the first one is that Jim and I have run for 3 years, making knowledge usable. The second one is partly overlapping. It's also about expertise, but it's focused on the IPCC, which I and Adam Standring has conducted. And a third one is Karin Gustafsson, so also is part of at this seminar. You can see him here about the socialization of young scholars to IPCC and IPES. And besides these projects on expertise, our research group also conduct research on issues such as social transformation, degrowth, risk governance, ethical consumption, and environmental representation. I also would like to take the opportunity to inform about this paper that James, I, and Adam published a month ago about what to consider when developing a social scientific expertise for social transformation. I see now that you are all very qualified and more qualified than myself in this issue about expertise, so I will try to be rather short in my giving the more context about what the empirical study. And we know a current situation that knowledge production and decision making has been increasingly connected, and that there is few, if any, proposals for environmental regulation that is not based on science. We also know that there have been an enormous growth in scientific knowledge, which have been met by a number of activities in order to summarize and make this knowledge usable. We have seen a number of examples of how science in different way have been asked for or been communicated to decision maker or the wider public. But as we know, it's not only requested science, it's also contested, frequently contested by many different actors, including political leaders. Yeah, and this means that expertise seems to be very relevant, and we need to consider what is expertise, what constitutes expertise, and that is a fundamental question for a number of social sciences. What constitutes expertise and how to achieve epistemic authority. And what's important is not only to scientifically define what expertise is, but also to take into account how expertise is understood in public discourses. And this photo reveals something here. Recently, in one of the biggest universities in Sweden, researchers succeeded to show how Coulomb's law, one of physics' most fundamental law, also seems to work solid in water. And with the help of a supercomputer at the calculation center in theoretical chemistry, they were able to model experimental systems in detail. And through computer modeling, they have produced these results. And then when the communication department at this university would like to make this as a main research news, the journalist or the communicator from that department come to the department and ask the researcher to wear laboratory coats because of the photo. And she took some photos, and then she asked if they could get the glass flask, this kind of test tube you can see the person, the sender, holds in her hand. And this despite that this research was done in a theoretical chemistry, which only use computer modeling. So I think these pictures reveals something important, how particular view on scientific expertise is maintained and reproduced in society and in media, and where science and expertise is associated with particular kind of laboratory practices. A central debate within expertise or within research on expertise is whether expertise is based on social attribution or on possession of specialized knowledge. And in the column to the left, you have the relational view, which states that to become an expert and maintain expert knowledge, that is the outcome of social negotiations and boundary work among involved actors. That means that it's not the third column is a way to try to combine them, saying that it's both competence and skills is necessary, but also social recognition. And this is the view that we put forward, that expertise is a social position for authoritatively delivering a recommendation within a specific knowledge domain. And that means that seeing expertise as a social position means that competence is central, the knowledge and skills, which is appropriated through social practices, education and training, within a particular community of experts. You need a group belonging in order to be socialized to become an expert. This competence needs to be recognized or known, otherwise it will not be requested. So it needs to be externally acknowledged by target groups. And it also needs to be requested. That means it needs to be evaluated as seen relevant by target groups, asking for experts' advice. And last but not least, it needs also to be comprehensible, to be understood. It needs to be trusted and understood both by peers and outsider. And we can today see a number of examples of books, which we could say is books written by experts or people that become experts and try to distribute this knowledge to a broader target groups. We have Breaking Boundaries, the Netflix series, with Johan Rockström as the main author of the book, and with a foreword by Greta Thunberg. We have Bill Gates, who also pay a lot of money to YouTube for advertisement about the climate issue. We have Hans Rosling, is quite famous for his YouTube speech, and we have also Mikael Klintman on knowledge resistance, which try to distribute this knowledge, making it understood and distribute it to different target groups. The implication of this is that this view on expertise is that expertise is always contextual. It's always related to particular problems and directed to different groups, target groups. It means also that to become an expert, to be expert, you need what's called interactional expertise. You need to know and understand field outside your own primary competence area in order to understand and to give advice for a more complex setting. You need also to balance internal legitimacy to be trustworthy toward your peers, the scientific community, and external relevance and credibility. And this also, you need to be trained and socialized into an expert community, a community of specialists, knowing how to assess knowledge, how to communicate it in a way that matters. And now I leave to you, Jim, to continue and present the empirical study.
Great, thanks very much, Rolf. Let's see. Great, so the portion of the speech that of the talk that I'll be giving focuses on IPBES and a particular problem which descends from this demand for expertise. And that problem that we're addressing is a kind of tension between, on the one hand, usable knowledge, and on the other, a pluralization of the knowledge base. So how is timely, usable knowledge produced when so many people have a seat at the table? And I think this is something that is recognized within IPBES. And this quote here from Pascual Diaz, I think Marie might have been involved in this one as well. The ability to overcome paralysis in the face of value pluralism, to engage in bridging, to mobilize transdisciplinary collaboration across a broad range of natural and social sciences, as well as other knowledge systems. So this idea here of the overcoming of paralysis in order to produce knowledge despite our differences. So our focus in addressing this problem is quite broad in a sense on environmental knowledge, not only within IPBES, but that is our focus. However, we also think that a lot of the issues that the analysis raises, identifies, can be applied not only to environmental expertise, but to expertise, knowledge, and value pluralism more generally. So the research is on IPBES. I don't need to introduce IPBES to this audience, only to say that pluralism is at the core, or diversity and pluralism are at the core of what IPBES does, not only what it researches, but also how, in a sense, by engaging people from many countries, from many different academic backgrounds together. The research was conducted primarily in 2020, and we spoke with 25 people, participants in IPBES at various different levels of the organization, involved at various different times. The selection criteria was made for involvement or understanding or some kind of relationship with Indigenous and local knowledge within the organization. So what is a paralysis? We understand paralysis in the paper to be an interruption to the movement of and control over the work of the organisation. In the particular case of IPBES, that is a threat to the ability to produce usable knowledge. And this is in terms of not only its timeliness, so the flow of the work, but also in terms of the credibility of the organisation and the relevance of the knowledge that's produced. An important thing to recognise here is that the threats to timeliness, credibility, relevance, as well as the priorities within the organisation are kind of interpreted and weighed differently by different members. And a lot of the tensions or the contestations that we are going to talk about are really around how these different issues are thought about and negotiated. Paralysis can occur, or the potential for paralysis is present at many different moments throughout what we call the knowledge assessment pipeline, and there's 4 of those that we want to bring attention to in the paper. So the first one is a potential paralysis for organisation. So IPBES is run and governed through the maintenance of mandates for work and through scheduling. There are disagreements that surface within the organisation around these questions, around management and the methodological practices that are used. And on the surface, these might seem quite technical, bureaucratic concerns, but at heart, a lot of the time is the question of what is important within the organisation and who gets to decide what it is that is important. So this potential paralysis of organisation is something that's always there, but principally in terms of the mandating at the beginning of the work. Judgment is kind of the next paralysis that we have identified, and this is around the question of what is valid or relevant to an assessment. And there's a couple of different ways that this goes, or at least revealed by our research. The first is on this question of what is and isn't new knowledge. So there is a stipulation that no new knowledge can be undertaken, or no new research can be undertaken for the assessment. So therefore, the sources, the literatures that are drawn on, the knowledge that's drawn on, is in some ways apprehended differently by different people. So does this mean that only academic literature can be drawn on? Can other forms of grey literature reports be drawn on? What about tacit knowledge? What about knowledge that's held in people's heads? Does that count as new knowledge or not? Another potential side of paralysis around judgment is this question of whether Indigenous and local knowledge is able to respond to the drivers of global change. So this seems to have been a concern quite early on in IPBES that's largely less a site of, or less likely to cause paralysis these days. And the next one is on translation. So this is how is expertise put into policy. And here the negotiations tend to be over questions of, on the one hand, what is policy relevant? And then also, how is that put into a document in a way that draws that relevance to the fore? And then the second question is what isn't, or how far can we go before it is policy prescriptive? So these different barriers that are set up within this process of translation are kind of constantly negotiated. There's kind of perhaps 2 sites where you see that translation. One is in the assessments, the scientific groups themselves, and another one is in the summary for policymakers. From what I understand of the work in the summary for policymakers, it's much more visible, possibly much more pressure to meet deadlines, and from what I understand, there hasn't been any major paralyses there at that point of the work. And the final one here then is communication. So how is policy impact sought? And on the one hand, this is about how are the assessments circulated, how is policy how policy intervention sought, but at heart here is really different thoughts about what the nature of the problem is and how it should be dealt with. So again, on the surface, it might seem like a technical issue of communication, but underneath there is much more pressing issues around the nature of the problem. Okay, so these kinds of different paralyses have been approached within IPBES, and that they're all kind of recognised by people in our interviews. They are discussed in many of the formal documents. However, they are dealt with in several different ways and are left somewhat open to be kind of flexibly applied within the organisation. So our approach has been to identify or to work with the practices that are much more backstaged and to try and identify the logics that guide what those practices are, the kinds of decisions people make when they're seeking to negotiate these possible paralyses around pluralism. So we regard these three logics, which I'll present now, as ideal types. We consider them to be self-consistent ways of understanding choices to act in one way or another. Often in practice, they're applied in partial and blended ways. Right, so the first one is the integrationist logic. So here there is an assumption that all knowledge can and indeed should be integrated into a syncretic or systematic whole. There is a kind of multi-scalar understanding of interdisciplinarity here, in which different disciplines have a kind of temporal and a spatial focus, and it's possible to kind of bring those together into a single optic. And that from this kind of comprehensive system of understanding, a correct course of action or courses of action, best practices can be identified. Within this logic, Indigenous and local knowledge is regarded as just not the same thing as science, but it is able to be brought into the overall framework in order to inform and improve policy. The integrationist logic descends from a systems theoretical perspective on nature and society relations, in which there's a focus on relationality, on process, but also a very strong stressing on the functionality or the functionalism of the system, rather than, say, its discourse or aesthetic concerns. And this approach is expressed most clearly in the conceptual framework, which makes some statements about the role of conceptual frameworks or systematic frameworks for a way of bringing together work from different backgrounds. Within this logic, ILK remains subservient to science and is therefore at risk of being co-opted into agendas that are perceived to be colonialist and capitalist. So I have a quote here from somebody who is expressing this logic. So I think the conceptual framework is a really good tool if you do it properly when you're talking about a more holistic approach. It goes back to that question you asked before about different scientific groups siloing. So the conceptual framework brings you that more holistic way of explaining to people or scientists or whoever they are that there are many ways of looking at the topic, and this allows you to bring lots of other knowledge systems and other ways of thinking into how you do things. The second logic is the parallelist logic, and these kind of two terms of integrationist and parallelist we are borrowing from the paper here by Tenger and Brondizio and some others. So these are not our terms that we've come up with, but although we are taking them, I think, in some new directions. The parallelist logic, in any case, is or begins from the position that knowledge cannot be divorced from the values and the time and the place in which it was developed. As such, there is no external, unbiased point of reference which is able to validate other knowledge systems, and therefore validation can only take place from within a knowledge system. As such, rather than try to integrate knowledge, emphasis is placed on identifying connections and building bridges between knowledge systems or worldviews. Policy is improved when offered options that are supported by a range of evidence and example, rather than identifying the correct policy from a kind of cohesive whole. This logic finds its clearest expression within the multiple evidence base. I'm sorry, 1 second. No, it's Thank you. Hopefully they don't ring back. Okay, where was I? Expressed in yeah. So the multiple evidence base is a document that is cited from within the paper introducing the conceptual framework. So these things are not distinct. In fact, they overlap in a lot of important ways. However, we would argue that there is kind of some important differences between them which need to be brought to the fore. The parallelist logic, it does tend to downplay historical and contemporary interconnections between knowledge systems. So it has a tendency, therefore, to suppress conflicts and limit the opportunity for novel insights that might come through integration. We are not a vacuum sucking information from Indigenous and local communities. We would like to have that information available to put alongside and with science, Western science. And this was another thing, fighting against words like integration, blending, because it's not that. Because in the end, science then dominates always. It is actually putting on the table alongside science this, and this, and using specific examples to take back Indigenous and local knowledge holders some facts, some ideas that have come from the scientific community. So what I think is interesting here is there's a kind of symmetry in which it's not only that Indigenous and local knowledge is brought into the scientific community, but also that scientific knowledge is taken back to Indigenous communities. The final logic we've called the Pragmatist logic. And this has come out of the research that we've done. It's not expressed in a document so far as we could find, but nevertheless is a useful way of grouping together a lot of statements that were made about practices within IPBES that don't clearly fall within these other kinds of logics. So the pragmatist responds directly to the problem, biodiversity loss, as it currently stands or as it's been defined, by identifying what works. These questions of ontology and epistemology, of validation of knowledge, of the synthesis of knowledge, these questions are suspended. They're regarded as not to be important to the problem, and emphasis is instead placed on delivering the right message to the right person or people in a language that they will understand. So we think that this logic has kind of emerged through 3 different steps or 3 different aspects. So the first is from a more governance or management perspective, an emphasis being placed on practices and finding commonalities between practices rather than commonalities between beliefs and belief systems. We also think there's an emergence of an ignorance, and this is not necessarily ignorance in a derogative sense, but an ignorance as in something that we just haven't understood or sought to understand yet, or an ambivalence towards these problems of plurality. And then also there is an increased recognition that different audiences require different theories, that different people are more able to be convinced by different approaches. So the danger or the worry with the pragmatist logic is that it ignores or backgrounds structural inequalities that precede knowledge and knowledge groups, but also this problem of the problematization of what IPBES is doing, that it accepts from the beginning that the biodiversity crisis has been defined as it should be. If you want policymakers to take up your ideas and change the way they are dealing with ecosystem management, I couldn't go to, say, the United States Environmental Protection Agency and say nature's contribution to people, and they would know off the bat what I was talking about. But ecosystem services has been around more, and it has been embedded in legal frameworks now. I think it has more saliency in the policy world, probably. Right, so there's a stress in that quote on really matching or taking your language and adapting it for the audience that you're speaking with in order to achieve a goal. So as said, these three different logics, we don't regard them to be programs that are fully inscribed within the organization, but rather these kind of ideal types that are a useful way of grouping together different practices. And having this approach to these logics allows us to create more of a map of possibilities, different ways of negotiating the problems that plurality raises within IPBES, within environmental and expertise in general. So that's what we've presented here. So this has on the rows, it has the three different logics: Integrationist, Parallelist, Pragmatist, and then it has on the first two, it has kind of a reminder of their position, their philosophical positions, and then on the remaining four is the four different paralyses. So the integrationist position strives for a single ontology, but accepts that there's multiple different ways of producing knowledge and finding out about the world. The parallelist will agree on the multiplicity of ways of finding out knowledge, but would also want to assert that those worldviews, knowledge systems can be discrete or should be discrete. The pragmatist regards these issues as irrelevant. So the paralysis of organization, this is dealt with by emphasizing different aspects of the work. For the pragmatist, this means that the focus is on observing the organizational mandate, making sure that the deadlines are met. It's quite an institutional form of practice. The integrationist seeks to put attention into the synthesis of published materials and sees that as a really important way of overcoming potential political concerns that are raised and might slow down the organization. The parallelist will seek to go beyond the integration of materials and try to stress dialogue and other forms of participation of Indigenous and local knowledge holders. The way of addressing organizational paralysis here is by making a genuine, or what is seen to be a genuine and fundamental attempt to engage with plurality within the organization. Given that IPBES has practices in place that are trying to meet or produce usable knowledge in a timely fashion, these efforts are sometimes seen as a source of rather than a kind of resolution to the organizational paralysis. The paralyses of judgment and translation are dealt with, or we expect to be dealt with, according to the kind of epistemological assumptions of the different logics. Judgment here is a question of what should be included, and then translation is the question of how it should be included. What knowledge should be included? Translation is how should it be included. So the integrationist adopts a material, has I guess a hierarchical approach to different knowledge systems, at the top of which sits a more kind of traditional and scientific or natural empiricist perspective, and so it adopts a materialist and at times even positivist approach to selecting what to include, and then presents it as the objective facts. The parallelist instead will prioritize internal validation as a way to get through the thicket of judgment or the paralysis of judgment. And then in the translation, we'll stress bridging, stress these ways, interconnections between knowledge systems. And for the pragmatist, the selection of materials is a practical choice about what most addresses the problem of the assessment. And then there is, in translation, a presentation of that which works. Finally, on the question of communication, the integrationist logic will stress the importance of consensus. We'll say that there is a unified or universal, we'll want to say, view from the scientific and other knowledge perspective. And this kind of belies, or this sits over the top of a view about change, in which if we have knowledge, then surely action will follow from that. The Parallelist has a more liberal view on the way to affect policy, which seeks to offer options to policymakers, decision takers, as a way to try and, I guess, present possibilities. There's also a more kind of progressive angle to this, in which the goal of doing this is not only to present options for policy, but also to kind of alter the mediating relationship that science plays between society and nature. And so address a lot of what is seen to be the causal reasons for, in this case, biodiversity loss. The pragmatist is not so ambitious as this. They take a much more strategic focus, in which they're matching up the right information with the right audience at the right time. And therefore, in some ways, they're much more aware of the different forms of authority that exist and how to use them. So this map of possibility suggests that there are, as we move from left to right, from organization through judgment, translation, communication, that there are different pathways through the organization, that perhaps somebody could be an integrationist in one step, but then would move into a parallelist position in another. That somebody might stress pragmatism in one conflict or one potential disagreement, but might move into a different kind of position on another. It also suggests the possibility of hiding places where positions that would be considered intolerable in one frame could kind of rest and pause in another. So you could have, for example, a position that was very much scientific positivist in a sense, stressing the need for pragmatic action. So this returns us to the problem. How is timely usable knowledge produced when so many people have a seat at the table? So our answer to this question, in the case of IPBES, that it's not done by a single formalized best practice, but it's done through negotiation internally. This would suggest that there's a lot of variation in the way that these types of potential paralyses are handled, and that in fact not having a formalized best practice is a way of allowing for that kind of interpretive flexibility within the organization. As such, we believe that if there were to be some kind of epistemic closure on how to negotiate pluralism within IPBES, that it could come at the risk of closing off a lot of this flexibility which happens within the knowledge assessment pipeline. So what does this say about expertise and knowledge pluralism more generally? We think that it could indicate that an idea of epistemic ambiguity or not fully closing off how pluralism is to be dealt with could be a conscious organizational position. I don't think that it is for IPBES, but it could be for another organization. And one of the reasons why this has worked in the cases of IPBES is because it does have very strong organizational values and a culture of respect for Indigenous and local persons. And I think this is really important in allowing these multiple different logics to interact. And there's also a question here about whether there's possibility for a more agonistic approach to pluralism, in which that conflict is seen as the very basis for the legitimacy of the knowledge that's being produced. The world is messy, therefore our policy recommendations are messy as well. That's not something that IPBES do, but it could be something another organisation does. Great, thank you very much. I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, Rolf and Jim, for this really interesting presentation. Yeah, there's some really new ways to think about, because this is, well, at least in my experience, it's discussed a lot within the process of producing an assessment in IPBES and in other relations. So that's really an interesting look at all these discussions that I've participated in myself in different IPBES contexts. So thank you so much.